First, I'm going to introduce to my immediate left my friend and one of my political mentors, Grant Lally, is the managing partner of Lally and Messier, LLP. Mr. Lally is an experienced practitioner with an extensive background in commercial and corporate transactions, federal and state litigation, administrative proceedings, and appellate practice. He has practiced law for over 20 years in New York, in the New York metropolitan area, and is also a solicitor in the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom. You notice the order of that, Ireland first.
That's all I want to be.
Mr. Lally has handled many high-profile matters, including successfully litigating major election cases and appeals, most notably representing, I guess it was then Governor George W. Bush, before the Miami-Dade and Orange County Board of Elections during the 2000 Florida recounts. He was the founding president of the Federal Society for Law and Public Policy Studies Long Island chapter, and served as founding chairman of the New York State Republican Lawyers Association. He served on the National Board of Governors of the Republican National Lawyers Association from 1990 to 2008. Mr. Lally graduated with his BA with honors from the Johns Hopkins University. He received his JD from Boston University School of Law and earned an LLM in International and Comparative Law from Georgetown University Law Center. Grant Lally.
Thank you, Mike.
I'm going to introduce him and then you could start. First of all, let me tell you that one of our panelists today, Hans von Spakovsky, was unable to make it. He has been stranded in the, I guess, Washington Reagan National Airport for since midday because of the weather. And John told him he should take Amtrak, and he should have listened to John. And with that, I'm going to introduce our next panelist. John Fund is National Affairs Columnist for National Review magazine, and he contributed to the Fox News channel. He is considered a notable expert on American politics and the nexus between politics and economics. He previously served as a columnist and editorial board member for the Wall Street Journal. He is the author of several books, including Stealing Elections, How Voter Fraud Threatens Our Democracy, and The Dangers of Regulation Through Litigation. He worked as a research analyst for the California legislature in Sacramento before beginning his journalism career as a reporter for the syndicated columnists, the legendary Roland Evans and Robert Novak. That was, of course, the highlight of CPAC, Novak and Sam Donaldson. Roll Call, the newspaper of Capitol Hill, called him the Tom Paine of the modern conservative reform movement. He has won awards from the Institute for Justice, the School Choice Alliance, and the Warren Brooks Award for Journalistic Excellence from the American Legislative Exchange Council. Okay, with that, Grant will deliver his remarks first, and then we will hear from...
we agreed that I was going to.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I thought it said last, but it's... Okay. No A. John, you go first.
Fair enough. Okay. Thanks for coming out, and thanks for Mike and everybody else who helped arrange this event. I know it was previously scheduled for October, but I understand that there was somewhat of a bit of inclement weather that day. So I'm glad to see Long Island is on the mend and such a good turnout tonight. I still write for the Wall Street Journal. I'm a columnist for National Review and contributor to Fox News. How many of you read or watch Fox News, National Review, Wall Street Journal? I think that covers almost everyone in the room. So thank you for helping me be myself. My talk tonight is going to be 3 quick parts. The first part is explaining to you why we have a problem. The second part is explaining something that you can do personally, right here and right now, to help solve this problem or prevent it from getting worse. And then after Grant and I have both spoken, I hope we can take as many of your questions as possible. Now, my book is not just about voter fraud, it's about bureaucratic bungling, because one of the things I learned in researching this topic is incompetence in our election administration is so great that you can't always tell where the incompetence ends and where the fraud begins. Sometimes the laws are written, especially in a place like New York State, to create purposeful confusion. And in that purposeful confusion, you can do an awful lot of things in between the cracks. But let's presume that we're going to talk mostly about voter fraud, proven voter fraud, rather than election administration incompetence, although there's a lot of that. The critics of people who want to clean up our elections and have honest, fair elections, the critics have three major problems: public opinion, the legal record, and the public policy record. Public opinion. Americans get this issue. They don't understand why, if you have to, for example, on the issue of photo ID, although that's only one of the ways that we can improve the integrity of elections, they don't get it that if you have to show photo ID to board a plane, to ride Amtrak, to check into a hotel, to cash a check, to sign up for Medicare, to get married, gay or straight, you have to show photo ID. You have to prove you are who you say you are. Why would voting be anything different? Public opinion gets this. 75 to 80% of people support photo ID. That includes, by the way, over 65% of African Americans and over 65% of Hispanic Americans. In fact, out of 38 demographic categories that pollsters use to split up the electorate, there's only one group in which photo ID loses by a plurality. It's 48-42. That is known as self-described progressive liberals, otherwise known as MSNBC viewers. And even there, they can't get above 50%. And by the way, interestingly enough, when Rasmussen surveyed voters, do you think voter fraud is a serious problem in America? A higher percentage of African Americans said yes than white Americans. The explanation is many of them live in communities where they actually are governed by a machine that makes certain that they don't have good government services, good schools, good roads, and they know about this problem because they actually see it up close with their eyes. Second problem that the critics of voter integrity have is legal. The Constitution has been deemed by the Supreme Court to support states' rights to have voter ID laws. The famous case was the Indiana case in 2008. It was a 6-3 case. The opinion was written by John Paul Stevens, who at the time was the most liberal member of the Supreme Court. And what he said is there is a long storied history of voter fraud in this country, and he didn't have to point out, but most of the court observers knew he was from Chicago. And if you're from Chicago, you know something about this subject. Vote early, vote often. That phrase was invented in Chicago, although practiced many other places. And then there's the public policy argument. The public policy argument is very simple. We have voter fraud, and we have a lot of people who lack confidence in our elections. 40% of Americans do not have a great deal of confidence that their votes are counted fairly or accurately. So, what is the response of the people against this? Well, the other public policy argument. The last bipartisan commission that we had studying election reform in this country was a commission co-chaired by Jimmy Carter, the former president, and James Baker, the former Secretary of State. 21 members, divided equally between Democrats and Republicans. The vote in favor of photo ID required at the polls was 18-3. That's called bipartisan. Jimmy Carter held the press conference in which he announced, "My Carter Center does elections all over the world. We cannot presume that we have any freer or fairer elections in America than we do overseas unless we take basic fundamental steps to ensure the integrity of our elections." In other words, it's a form of Reaganism. Trust but verify when it comes to voting. So what is the response of the left and other critics of photo ID and other laws for election integrity? Very simply, it's this. There is no voter fraud. It doesn't exist. You're more likely to be struck by lightning. Well, it's fascinating because I opened up the Drudge Report today, And it turned out that there were 6 people indicted for voter fraud in Cincinnati, Ohio from the last election, including a nun who was a professor at a local Catholic college. One lady who was an election official was indicted for voting 6 times. 6 times. That's taking vote early and often. She probably voted late too.
Well, it's only one man, one vote. Didn't say anything about
But of course, as you know, there is no voter fraud. Mr. Durham in the back was telling me the story in Long Beach here in Long Island, the nursing homes. King David Nursing Home being one, where apparently every year the turnout would be extremely high in these nursing homes, and 100% of the vote would be for Democrats. 100%. He said you'd think they might be just a little bit clever and sort of throw a few votes just to make it look less obvious. So finally, apparently, the state ultimately ruled that you had to have bipartisan election observers go into a nursing home if there was an large absentee vote that was going to be counted and cast. And after that happened, voter turnout in that nursing home went down by 1/3, and the Democratic share of the vote went from 100% to 75%. In other words, they ended up with half the votes they would otherwise get. But of course, as you know, there is no voter fraud. And then there's the case of Al Franken, the comedian, otherwise known as an allegedly United States Senator.
He's in my trunk.
In 2008, he won election by 312 votes in Minnesota. Now, his election was significant because he became the 60th vote for the Democrats in the Senate for Obamacare. He needed 60 votes to break a filibuster. He provided that 60th vote. We would not have Obamacare in its current form. It probably would have been much watered down without Al Franken's vote. So he changed history. We now know from material that has come to light since the election, in which he ultimately won after 6 months of court battles, we now know that there were 1,299 felons who can be proven voted illegally in that election because they were not eligible to vote. 1,299. Now, we can't know for sure, because it was a secret ballot, how they voted. But when Fox News did a survey of them, 90% of them said they voted for a certain candidate. And his name was Al Franken. So we can presume that the vast majority of those went for Al Franken, and he won by 312 votes. Now here's the kicker. The left says, well, so what? I mean, it couldn't possibly have been an organized attempt. Well, I don't know if it was organized or not, but it was real enough, because while you couldn't prosecute anyone in Minnesota if they'd voted illegally, unless you could prove that they had known that they were a felon and not eligible to vote, there were a bunch of people who, when they were interviewed by the law enforcement officials, were stupid enough to say, not only did I know I couldn't vote, not only did I know I was a felon, but I voted anyway. In other words, they confessed. To this date, we have had 199 people convicted of felony voter fraud from that group of felons. Another 74 cases in the pipeline, more being investigated. We may end up, before the statute of limitations wears out, we may end up with more people convicted of felony voter fraud in that election than the margin of victory. But of course, as you know, there is
No voter fraud.
There you go. Now, how did we get to this point where people taking such a preposterous position can have any influence in American life? Well, they had one ace in the hole. In 2008, a man who, well, you know well, was elected president. This is a man whose background was a
Community organizer.
What you may not know is this. His first job as a community organizer was with a group called Project Vote. Project Vote was in Chicago, and it was the voter registration arm of Acorn, the notorious group that was exposed by James O'Keefe in his videos and ultimately went bankrupt. They weren't just involved in voter fraud, they apparently were involved in suborning prostitution and other interesting crimes. Obama was not just the voter registration coordinator for Acorn. He did such a good job there that he became their top trainer in Chicago for their seminars. He did such a good job with that, he became their lawyer. And in 1993, when the left's dream of altering our election laws on a nationwide basis, because we normally do election law by all 50 states, 50 states has its own version, they passed something called the Motor Voter Law. The motor voter law created the template for much of the voter fraud we see today. It established that you could not remove someone from the voter rolls for at least 4 federal elections, 8 years. In other words, if they were dead, you couldn't automatically remove them. They had to stay on the rolls. But they were a permanent source of mischief for anyone who wanted to use the rolls for ill purposes. It also provided nationwide postcard registration. You could register just with a postcard. You didn't even have to show up and prove anything about yourself. The voter law was challenged by the governor of Illinois, who said this is unconstitutional. It's a mandate, an illegal mandate on the states, making us do this. The person who went in to defend the law and to represent ACORN in making sure the law was implemented was Barack Obama. He is the lawyer from ACORN. So it shouldn't surprise you the people that he has appointed to the Justice Department regarding election law and civil rights. In fact, the person who has been in charge of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice under Eric Holder the last 3.5 years has been none other than a fellow named Tom Perez. You may have read in the newspapers very recently that Mr. Perez is apparently the leading, almost guaranteed nominee to be Labor Secretary.
Great.
In other words, his confirmation hearings are going to be coming up soon if he's appointed, and they will be quite boisterous. Who is Mr. Perez? Well, first of all, he's the guy who can't litigate straight. He has over and over been shot down by courts. His positions on civil rights issues have been rebuked by courts in Arkansas, the D.C. District Court, New York in an education case, U.S. v. Brennan, Florida abortion case, where his civil rights lawyers were abusively prosecuting peaceful protesters, and a major Perez loss in Florida, they tried to force the state not to remove non-citizens from its voter rolls, even when they had identified them using public records. In addition, he sued South Carolina for having the temerity to pass a voter rights law. A 3-judge federal panel, which included a Clinton appointee, unanimously ruled his case was so frivolous the Justice Department would have to pay all of South Carolina's legal bills for filing the case. Perez has also hired, personally, he has insisted that he approve each one of the new hires for civil service. These are non-political positions at the Department of Justice and Civil Rights Division. And he's hired 113, all of them liberal Democrats. In fact, liberal activists. Even admitted this fact, even admitted by the New York Times. In fact, many of them hailed from backgrounds with outfits such as, quote, the Intersex Society of North America, unquote. Or they were authors of essays such as Genital Normalizing Surgery on Intersexed Infants. Or they fiercely advocated the rights of prisoners in Arizona to perform Hawaiian chants and rituals. These are the kind of people directing our civil rights law today. Now, who is Mr. Perez? He is a Democratic liberal activist from the state of Maryland, and he used to be president of Casa de Maryland, an extreme advocacy organization which major platform is it opposes the enforcement of any and all immigration laws. Any and all immigration laws. And this is the man in charge of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. The group has encouraged illegal aliens never to speak with police officers or immigration agents, never to reveal their names to them. It has fought restrictions on illegal aliens receiving driver's licenses. It has urged police departments not to enforce federal fugitive warrants, and it has advocated giving illegal aliens in-state tuition and actively promulgated day labor sites where illegal aliens and employers can skirt federal prohibitions on hiring undocumented individuals. In addition, he's also been very active in New York. In New York, he has filed a case against the New York City Fire Department, where he argues for strict racial quotas. His position is that black firefighter applicants who fail 70% of the entrance exam should automatically be admitted to the fire academy. By the way, even the Second Circuit Court of Appeals found this too much. It issued a stay blocking enforcement of the Perez team's preferred outcome that would have punished the fire department, and that will be litigated. I suspect they will lose that case. And then, of course, there's the new Black Panther Party. It was Perez who recommended that the new Black Panther Party members in Philadelphia, who were seen outside polling places in military uniforms, carrying nightsticks, yelling racial epithets at potential voters, did not commit a civil rights crime worthy of prosecution. He dropped the case within weeks of taking office as Civil Rights Division head. Now, there were various lawsuits and various internal investigations that were launched of the new Black Panther Party case, the dismissal. And sure enough, Perez had to testify under oath. He testified under oath that there was absolutely no political involvement by the White House or the superiors in making the new Black Panther case dismissal decision. But after an extensive investigation, federal judge Reggie Walton of the District of Columbia concluded the following. The documents I have seen reveal that political appointees within DOJ undisputably were conferring about the status and resolution of the new Black Panther Party case in the days preceding the DOJ's dismissal of claims in that case, which completely contradicts, these are his words, Assistant Attorney General Perez's sworn testimony that political leadership was not involved in that decision. Surely the public has an interest in documents that cast doubt on the accuracy of government officials' official representations regarding the possible politicization of agency decision-making. In other words, the federal judge is calling him a lie and a perjurer. This is the man who's about to be nominated Secretary of Labor. Now, the good news is this record is so egregious, so outrageous, that I suspect even the normally spineless group of people called the Senate Republican Caucus may rise and do something about this. And this is where you come in. No, don't write Senator Schumer, don't write. Been there, done that. I'm sure Mike and others, or Grant, can get you the names of the Republican Senate Judiciary Committee. If you contact them by email, it doesn't matter that you're not from their state. Every person who writes them will be counted as 1,000 people who think the same way. And if they know that the base, the activist base of the Federalist Society opposes Perez's nomination and would support a filibuster of his nomination, you will have some impact. And I urge you to do that, because I can assure you, the Department of Labor is going to have a very important role in the next 3 or 4 years. Remember, it was just last month that a federal court in Washington ruled that every one of Obama's appointees to the National Labor Relations Board had been appointed illegally.
Right.
And that all of their decisions were null and void. Perez will try, even if that NLRB decision stands, he will try to implement many of those regulations through the Labor Department. In addition, we know that while many of those can ultimately be blocked, it would be much better to send a message that whoever is nominated in the Department of Labor has to have at least a scant knowledge of the rule of law and at least some minimal respect for it. So even though I'm here to discuss voter fraud, and I'll be happy to chat about my book with you, you don't have to buy a copy, I'm happy to chat with you one way or the other at the back of the room after this. This is much bigger than voter fraud. This is the integrity of our appointment process, that someone like this could even be considered for such a position. And by the way, the only reason he's being considered, frankly, is not just that he's a radical lawyer, but that with the departure of every Hispanic cabinet member in Obama's team, there is no one of Hispanic origin in the Obama cabinet right now. He would fix that. He would at least give them a token representation of the Obama cabinet. That's the only reason he's being appointed. Even they are nervous about his record. Why are they nervous? Today at 3 o'clock this afternoon, the Department of Justice's Inspector General, normally a lapdog because they were appointed by the Obama administration, came out with a searing indictment of his management of the Department of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Their own Inspector General today strongly criticized them for politicizing the agency, threatening and intimidating employees there who did not toe the party line. So with this record, I think there's a chance to stop this monster. And if we do, I think it will not only be a step forward for the rule of law and in the integrity of government, but I think it will be a powerful message that just as the grassroots made some difference in sequester, and just as the grassroots made some difference in forcing Obama to break down after last week's filibuster, it will have some power to affect an important public policy issue in the coming weeks, if he's not. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all for being here tonight. I'm not Hans von Spakovsky. I understand they're still sitting on the tarmac in Washington, but It is a pleasure to be here tonight, and it's with so many old friends. Before I was going to talk a bit about some of the election fraud that I witnessed in handling litigation and campaigns over the years. Florida in 2000 for President Bush, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, which I handled for both President Bush in 2004 and for Senator McCain in 2008. What little we could do, at least in the latter one. And I'm working for Congressman Bob Turner and handling his election litigation. By the way, in all of these elections, there was tremendous fraud. There was also tremendous incompetence, which, frankly, is shocking and could have created even more fraud had people been in place to exploit it. But before I go into that, I just want to echo and to thank John Font for bringing to this group and bringing to a broader audience the danger of this Perez nomination. We all saw last week what one courageous individual standing on principle, and it was Senator Rand Paul, what he can do by standing on a national stage, and how that inspired numerous other senators, many of whom would normally be very cynical, to get up and stand with him. And really how the Republican Party in some ways is now finding, because of the radicalism, because of the outrages of the Obama administration, now the Republicans are beginning to find their voice and beginning to stand. So I just want to echo what John said, which is it's very important to let people in Washington know. And with this Perez nomination coming down the pike, I mean, it is a monstrous proposal. And given the record of this man, this must be stopped. And if we're active and if we're united, we can stop it. So, but it means that they say that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Now's the time. So I know we'll provide some contacts, but it's very, very important. I want to thank John for raising that very, very important issue. John said it very well. Our system has it is a hodgepodge system of election administrations across this country. There is just shocking incompetence in the election, in the administration of our elections, and sometimes that incompetence is just purely due to human incompetence, and sometimes it is actually by design to facilitate or to perpetuate what have been abuses of the system. I just will I'll give you a few examples of just what I witnessed in some of the elections that I've worked on. Most recently, I worked on what I saw was in Bob Turner's election. Congressman Bob Turner, former Congressman Bob Turner, in Queens and Brooklyn. Now, this is a district that had not seen Republican representation in that area in over 70 years. So this had been an area where Republicans were not competitive, where often you didn't have Republican inspectors at the polls. Oftentimes it was only Democrats. But in this race, because of the changing demographics of the district, and because people had just gotten sick of Obama and were very upset at the policies that he was following, both foreign and domestic, you really saw a groundswell. You saw a lot of support from people like the late Mayor Ed Koch. But you saw a real groundswell of support suddenly shifting over to Bob Turner. And that created literally a panic in Democratic Party ranks. So one of the things that we did in Bob Turner's campaign is we went out aggressively to try to damp down the amount of fraud. We'll never get rid of all of it, but at least take a stand and damp down in ways that had not been done probably since Giuliani's election in 1993, a good 20 years. And what we did is what we found was that the Board of Elections was not purging and was sending out absentee ballots, literal ballots, to people on what they call the permanent absentee list. Just people that just mail absentee ballots out. We also ran that list against a list of people who had passed away. I found there were literally thousands of ballots being mailed out in that district to dead people. And we sued. We successfully secured an injunction to lock all of that paper down so that wouldn't be counted on Election Day, and that no one could vote those ballots. But literally what they were doing is they were mailing them out, And if you happened to be the person who received it, you opened it, you had a ballot, you could check that ballot off, walk into a polling site, slip it into the machine, and we cast a vote. Now, you're supposed to mail it back, but and the machines are supposed to be programmed not to accept them, but it's the same structure ballot, and the programming is often not done. So people could actually cast those. So we secured an injunction. But probably the most telling thing is we report, it was the day after the election, Weprin was going to concede, I was advised, within the hour. So really the Democratic Party and its lawyers already had conceded the election. But the chief elections attorney for the New York City Board of Elections was steaming and indignant because we had gone outside of Queens County to get the order signed, had it returnable before Brooklyn, so it took it out of their sandbox. But he was steaming mad, and he got up and he told the judge, he said, "Judge, there's nothing improper with us mailing ballots to dead people," which is one of my favorite quotes. Luckily, the margin wasn't that close, and they conceded, and that paper was segregated and not counted. But again, it shows you that where there was a deliberate effort to commit voter fraud, here in New York, the Board of Elections is creating tremendous opportunities to conduct it. I also want to tell you a little bit about 2008 and 2004 in Cleveland, Ohio. Now, Cleveland is one of those wonderful places, and they have improved it in the last few years. But Cleveland has more people registered to vote. Mr. Cipolle, has more people registered to vote in Cleveland by several hundred thousand than the census shows there are people. So you get the wonderful phenomenon of 110% of the census population voting in elections in Cleveland. And it's it's often a well-oiled machine, and it is run both out of the wards and is also run out of the college campuses. And one of the things we found was Oberlin College, which is in the suburbs, had a phenomenal, an enormous voter fraud registration campaign. People who died would suddenly be re-registered under a new address, but now their age would change to 20. And we were able to trace this back to some of the clubs at Oberlin College, which were aggressively re-registering dead people and at new addresses, and simply going in and intending to vote those names. Juanita Smith was one that came to mind. But they also registered Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck in other parts of the state. But it was, it's part of a culture of voter fraud, which again, most of the radical Democrats will say just doesn't exist. But believe me, it does. I've got a few tales from the Miami recounts from 2000, but I'll relate one where fraud didn't occur, but is probably equally horrifying, which was the Miami-Dade Board of Elections. In Florida, every Board of Elections is a local canvassing board, is a local board. And the board is not actually, it's not a permanent board. The authority is not permanent. It's created ad hoc for each election. And they appoint a mix of public elected officials, some of whom are very partisan, and judges. Nearly all of whom are appointed out of one party or the other and have very clear political inclinations. And then sometimes they'll put a Board of Elections commissioner who is a civil servant on that canvassing board. But it's done very ad hoc, county from county. And as a result, especially in some counties in Florida, the process has become very sloppy. It's because of the transient population, people's names come and go off the lists. There's tremendous error rates and spelling errors. So you're starting with a system that already is already a sloppy system. But during the recounts, election night in 2000, initially Florida was called for Al Gore, and then by several of the networks. Then more of the vote came in. It was clear it was going to be too close to call, and at that point, after that, the recounts started. But you really, after the second machine count, you really only had the vote difference being a couple of hundred votes between George Bush and Al Gore. The Miami-Dade's canvassing board initially met and said, no, we're not. There's no need to have a recount. We have our count. That's a good count. We're going to stand by that. But political pressure being what it is, there was pressure put on one of the judges in particular on the board. And again, these judges are put on their sort of hazing duty. They're the lowest level judges. They're given this because they have to stay up late on election night. They can't go home and have dinner with their family. They're supposed to stay there as members of the canvassing board. So they aren't ready to, these folks are just generally not ready to stand there in the national spotlight and have 100 cameras on. So after they initially voted to not count that day, pressure was put on them. One of them popped and then the other one went along. And suddenly, a week and a half after the election, they reversed themselves and said, yes, we have to have a manual count of all the ballots cast in Miami-Dade County. So at that point, I sent over one of my assistants. I said, get over to the board, see where the ballots are, see where they're keeping them, make sure it's all under lock and key. So he goes over. This was Friday. The recount was due to start on Monday. He goes over and he says, well, where are the ballots? He said, oh, well, they're counting them upstairs. He said, what? He said, yeah, they're counting them upstairs. I gotta call 911. What's going on here? They said, oh, no, that's not for the presidential count. It's for Clay Shaw's recount, Congressman Clay Shaw, who had a very close election that year. So he gets on the elevator, goes up a floor, and there, in a room this size, on a bunch of tables, the ballots are just spread out loose. There was one representative of Clay Shaw's campaign talking on a cell phone in the hallway. There was one member of the campaign of his opponent. There was one security guy who was in the men's room at the time that he came up. And he walked into the room and he looked at the ballots, and anyone could have taken them. Anyone could have taken an ice pick and punched holes through them. So he immediately got more security up to watch it. But they were conducting a whole separate recount with the same ballots and the same pieces of paper, with no security and no scrutiny, a week before they were then counted later. So it is symptomatic of the sort of the casualness and the sloppiness. But if someone were deliberate and wanted to go up there with an ice pick, they could have changed the history of the world. And that's unfortunately, that's part of the system that we're dealing with. And there sure are plenty of folks out there who want to exploit that. So it is a tremendous danger, and it is a threat to our democracy. There are a lot of common sense reforms, and John talked about some of them. Having more frequent purges is absolutely essential, just to keep voter rolls clean. Cross-referencing against obituaries and against death records, absolutely essential. And frankly, showing ID at the polls is one of the most basic things that you can do to ensure the integrity of the vote. I mean, nobody who has any integrity thinks that there should be voter fraud. So it is not a position that anyone can plausibly take with any credibility. So even UN observers who are sent here, which I don't particularly like as a matter of principle, but even UN observers who are sent here to observe the integrity of U.S. elections have expressed shock that people come and vote and don't have to show identification, like they do in many countries in the world where democracy has been under threat. But here they don't have to do it, and they've expressed shock at that. So those are some common reforms. Let me throw it open to some questions, and thank you.
We've been joined by a very distinguished election lawyer, who is the County Attorney for Nassau County, John Ciampoli. John, I'm sure you have a question. You have a question, John? We'll let you start off.
Actually, Mike, I think John has the answers, not the questions.
The good news is that what Grant told you about what you could do with an ice pick, you can't do anymore because we've eliminated punch card ballots. The bad news is we have, and anyone who's voted, it kind of looks, the machines we use now, it looks like a trash can with a computer on top, and that's about what it is, it's a trash can. Okay, the problems now are greater than they were before. They've just been exacerbated by the equipment that we use, because this equipment is entirely hackable. Your county has, and it's only on a motion for leave to appeal to the Court of Appeals, a challenge to the certification of the voting machines that have been rammed down our throats in this state. Just so that you know, we spent, I think it was about $250 million on this equipment it is now beginning to reach its obsolescence, and the warranties on it are expiring within a year. So we may have to replace it all. The one hope that I have for all of you is hidden away in the old social service building.
The old,
At my direction, we have saved every one of our mechanical lever machines. Those things work. Okay, and in fact, we had, aside from the fine efforts that Grant and other people did during the 2000 election that gave us George W. Bush, the other thing that gave us a Republican president that year was a massive mistake made by the Democratic side. They forgot that there's this principle in our law called equal protection. They did not want to count the Republican areas principally in the panhandle of Florida. Well, you know what kind of machines they used in the panhandle? The lever machines like we used for years here in Nassau County. Those vote totals weren't going to change. Okay, it was the punch cards, and the thing that's most distressing about what Grant told you, they're handling punch cards. Every time you handle punch cards, you get more chads, you get little flakes in your rugs, which are really difficult to clean out, and you get more inaccurate results. Fortunately, Gore's people made the mistake back then. They did not think of equal protection. It would not have cost them to do a recount in the Republican areas in Florida where they used machines that were accurate, that where literally at the end of the night you lock the vote totals in and you can't move those digit counters. And if somebody were to fool around with it, and it has been done, but you leave a trail. Listen, there are a lot of things out there that are going to continue to pop up. The current dialogue now talks about having pre-election or pre-election day voting, early voting. That just lends itself to more fraud and more susceptibility for inaccuracy. Frankly, the last Senate seat that we had, I worked on that race, and to give you an idea, SUNY Albany, paid for with your tax dollars. They assemble a group, I forgot exactly what they called it, the opportunity program or equal opportunity program, and they literally told the kids, it doesn't matter where you're registered to vote. If you're registered to vote at home, register to vote here on campus. Well, we were able to, in the courtroom, knock out 2, maybe 3 of those ballots. Because literally the student came in and said, I live in the Bronx. Where's your home? In the Bronx. Where do you reside? In the Bronx. Why are you here in Albany? Because I go to school. Do you intend to stay in Albany? No. Okay, but those were only a few paper ballots that got caught as affidavit ballots. There were dozens of these students, if not hundreds, that voted on the machines. And that Senate race was decided by 18 votes. So everything you've heard here about how voter fraud affects the results of elections, I can tell you with great assuredness, Assemblyman Amador would today be Senator Amador, but for voter fraud that was perpetrated on the public with your tax dollars at SUNY Albany by telling people register to vote here, it doesn't matter where you reside. Okay, that's one of the battlefronts in this state on residency and how you can challenge residency. The electronics just lends a whole new layer to it. It's an important issue. It's going to keep coming back. And as elections across the nation get closer and closer, and there are more and more elections that are close, we're going to hear about this more. The problem we have is it is very difficult for a lawyer like Grant, a lawyer like myself, for any of us, to go and capture an election back after the election's been held. But like I said, you counties out there fighting for you. I'm hoping that the Court of Appeals notices this issue. We were dismissed on a procedural issue because quite frankly, our two election commissioners had a fight one week and one pulled his name off the lawsuit. So I no longer had a complete board as a client and the court knocked me out. With that said, I'll be around, we can chat.
This young lady over here had a question.
I think it's far more systemic. I do agree that there are machines and certainly the foibles of those, whatever. To quote our new illustrious Secretary of State, in the United States, we have the right to be stupid and to be disconnected if we choose to, and it is an acceptable way to live. Clearly, we have a pervasive level of stupidness, whatever that might mean in his. I wouldn't even want to conjure what his thought pattern is on that. The disconnect is very clear. And what you are saying, both of you, most articulately, is incredibly disturbing on a level that, for those of us who are obviously gathered here this evening, who are of like mind, and want to make change, we sit here, and even your last statement, we are hoping that, and it will appear to. There are no definitive statements as to what we can do. What can we do on levels such as this, and it has to start at this level. We have Obama now with his super duper wapo paco, whatever it is that they're all coming in and going to give money. What do we do to get to the colleges, to the grassroots level, to obliterate this concept that you can be stupid, that you can just accept everything that comes down, or that you can just sit there complacently and say, oh, well, we can't do anything about it. I find myself, my mind is ready to explode.
Well,
I've come here because I found like minds that are very meager in today's world, and I've been fortunate enough to circulate with people of all different levels with a verve and love for this country, but people are afraid to open their mouths, or just trying to figure out what do you do to change it. What do we do?
well, the first, there's a three-step process which I'll submit. The first step is absolutely, positively do not do what the other side wants you to do, which is despair and give up. A lot of what's happened in politics the last few years has been what I call a form of psychological warfare. They use their minions in the mainstream media and in various other outlets to try to demoralize you and convince you that it makes no sense to even fight back. That's the first thing. You cannot under any circumstances give in to despair, because that is precisely what they want you to do. The second thing you can do, and I say this as someone who spent a lot of time on this, voter fraud is a lot like shoplifting. If you take even basic precautions, or even tell people that someone is watching, you can reduce shoplifting by 30 to 40%. Study after study shows this. You don't have to catch everyone, you just have to let know someone is watching. Because voter fraud is tied in directly with the risk of being caught. And if there are some people who will do it if it's risk-free, and there are some people who will do it if there's a small risk, but there are a lot of people who won't. All you have to do is let people know someone is watching, someone is caring, and if you have that, you can reduce it to some extent. And as for New York State election law, the state Senate can block things like mandatory registration, early voting, and other things. New York State election law can always get worse, but only if you give in, and only if you give in to despair. The third thing that can happen is, I think with the heightened interest in voter fraud, lawsuits matter. And even in New York courts, you've had courts that have issued very fair rulings, and you've had some of the worst abuses corrected. Supporting groups that can file those lawsuits, supporting lawyers who can represent clients, can make an enormous difference. They will only engage in massive voter fraud if they think there's no one standing against them, if they're pushing against an open door. So I will tell you this, one of the reasons this is a two-edged sword as far as the people in this room are concerned, the good news is I do not believe the last election was decided by voter fraud. I believe there was voter fraud, but it was significantly reduced in many states because people were watching and because people were talking about it. In a closer election, it could have made a difference. And if the election had been really close as opposed to just somewhat close, I think we would have been very, very grateful. for the efforts that a few people had, including some people in this room, like the county attorney, would have made. And again, it's not just the presidential, it goes all the way down. I'm in control of the state senate, it's decided by a single vote. And one seat that slipped away from the Republicans was decided, as you mentioned, by 18 votes. So anything you do can make a difference. It can have an impact far beyond what you would immediately discern.
Ray, we'll take it, well, you want to?
No, I just want to add
Follow
an
up.
anecdote on
1
that.
minute, Ray.
Which is that when people are watching, voter fraud is massively diminished. And it's actually it's sort of a counterintuitive anecdote, which goes back to 2008 in Cleveland. I was running the Cleveland election day operations for the McCain-Palin presidential campaign. My grandmother was born in Cleveland 100 years ago. So I went to look at what the neighborhood while I was there, I took a look at the neighborhood, and it's now a pretty desolate area, not very prosperous. Actually, they've torn homes down. It's sort of returning to the wilderness as it's economically declined. But I vowed, I said, look, we can't cover the whole city. We can cover bits and pieces of it. So this is as good as any. I mean, there will not be any voter fraud in my grandmother's election district in this election. So I sent we assigned some people to cover that election district that day. And I got a phone call mid-morning. Oh, the local ward boss, he's really upset. He's steaming mad. He wants to throw everybody out of here. I said, let me go down. And I came down there, and it was a sort of an elderly African-American gentleman, and he was stomping around, and he had a lot of folks, sort of his usuals, who were there with him. And he was upset that there were Republicans there, but he was equally upset that SEIU, the union, and the Obama campaign had flown in all of these operatives from around the country, and they were standing there with clipboards from the Upper West Side of Manhattan or downtown Philadelphia. They're sitting there with clipboards questioning who people are. All of these strange people. He couldn't do what he normally did, was just roll people in, and whomever wanted to vote could vote of his group. So it's counterintuitive in that Obama's folks probably actually prevented some voter fraud in that area. But what it really means is if you have eyes, it works. I just relate one other one because this is a famous culprit. In 1988, in the presidential election, a good friend of mine, working on George Bush I's presidential campaign, went into a section. He was at Johns Hopkins Hospital, so he asked, can I have something, can I work on one of the election districts around the hospital? Now, the area around the hospital was, and I think still is, terrible. I mean, terrible housing, terrible crime. So, and there hasn't been a Republican elected from that area in, decades, and certainly not then. So he had this election district, and he's there, and they were a little annoyed that he was there. Like, who are you? Why are you here? No, Republicans don't come here, But while he's there, a bus pulls up, and out strolls, a local official with all these people, and they start coming and said, wait a minute. And he asked, wait a minute, these people aren't, they aren't checking in. They aren't identifying themselves. They're just, he said, and the local administrator said, oh, well, that's the congressman. They can vote. Don't worry. Don't worry. So it was Kwesi Mafumi with a bus full of just touring the neighborhood, casting votes at serial voting places. And he started to challenge my friend. He said, what are you doing here? These people are allowed, can vote any time. He said, no, look, no, you're not. They have to. Who are they? So I said, look, I'm just going to call the police and have them come down, and they can verify who's supposed to vote or not. Well, as soon as those magic words were invoked, Mafumi clapped his hands. Okay, everyone, these Republicans are trying to keep us from voting. Let's go. So not one of them, they all marched back on the bus and probably went 2 blocks over to the next polling place to vote. But again, there was one set of eyes, probably the first and last set of eyes of Republican eyes that were in that election district for a half century. But that was 30 votes probably right there. So,
Ray,
Yeah, I actually had 2 questions having to do with both of my lots in life. I mean, I'm an IT guy, so when you start to talk about losing the mechanical machines and start getting into these computer-driven machines, I wonder just how much more susceptible to hacking and every other thing those tend to be, especially in light of the fact that our Defense Department can't keep China out. That could be a problem. And then the other thing, as you could probably tell by my shirt, is I've been a hardcore Tea Party activist for the last 4 years. So needless to say, I've been called every name in the street, and racist is the least of them. And the whole voter ID thing, photo ID in particular, I mean, the whole argument is that it's it's racist to try and say, oh, you know, these people can't be expected to get an ID, and I just wonder what your opinion is, because my opinion is that it is the epitome of racism to say that they can't be expected to do what everybody else does and to, you know, have a voter ID. And, you know, by the way, the ultimate hypocrisy is that you can't go into the halls of Congress without that ID either.
Well, it's patronizing to make that claim. The Brennan Center, which is the leading, quote, think tank, unquote, that fights against voter ID laws, conducted a telephone survey a few years ago using very questionable methodology, which actually claimed that 25% of African Americans lack an
John,
ID.
we can't hear you back here.
Yeah.
Can't hear you back here.
I'm doing the best I can.
Okay.
I'm recovering from an illness, so I apologize. So the Brennan Center said, according to their telephone survey, 25% of African Americans lacked an ID to vote. And every speech I've ever given, especially when I'm debating someone from the other side, I say to the audience, is there anyone who believes that? Is there anyone who believes that people who obviously participate in the mainstream of economic life, they have to cash checks? If they want to get a benefit, they have to apply for it with an ID. If they're on Medicare or Medicaid, they have to apply for that with an ID. If they travel at all, they have to get an ID. If they check into a hotel, they have to get an ID. Is there anyone here who believes that 25% of African Americans, and nationwide they said it was 11% of all people, is there anyone here who believes that? And usually that's enough to intimidate people to not raise their hand, even if they do believe it. And then I just turn to the other side and say, who are you trying to fool? I mean, do you think we're stupid? You obviously think these people without an ID are stupid, because how do they function in life? I mean, it's the ultimate form of low expectations and patronization. And I think we have to call them on it. It's absurd. District courts that actually looked at the evidence in Georgia and Indiana, which were the two cases where voter ID laws were completely litigated, concluded that the plaintiffs in this case, chiefly the NAACP, could not produce one single human being who could plausibly say that they were denied the right to vote because they didn't have an ID. In other words, these cases may be like the man on the moon. There may be a man on the moon, but we haven't seen him yet. Now, one final point. Concessions have been made to the anti-photo ID law in state after state. In Pennsylvania, where the law was delayed in implementation but was approved constitutionally, in Pennsylvania they even went this far, because the argument was, okay, the state is giving a free ID, but let's say, you know, you were born 80 years ago and it's difficult to find your birth certificate or to find records, and you have to produce some records in order to get that state ID, even if it's free. And that could cost you money. It could cost you $15, it could cost you $20. That's discriminatory. So what the state legislature did is it said, okay, if you show up at a polling place and you claim, I don't have the money to get the background documents for state ID, and I sign an affidavit saying I am who I say I am, you can vote. And they still opposed the law, and they still sued in federal and state court. There is absolutely nothing you can do to accommodate them that will satisfy them, which makes you realize, what is it that's going on behind the curtain that we don't even realize? You know, there's an old saying about an iceberg. 1/10 is above the surface, 9/10 is unseen below the surface. What I want to know is, what is there about this issue in which they spend so much time and energy and money fighting? What is it about this issue where they must know something about these elections that we don't even know or even guess at?
Bill?
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question. This has to do with a little bit something you talked about discrimination, but concerning the Voting Rights Act of 1965, recently Judge Scalia, his words were taken out of context regarding the 15th Amendment, Article 5, I believe. And I was just wondering, he was inquiring questions into whether discrimination existed in Shelby County down south. I was wondering if I saw that on C-SPAN recently. He was more inquiring, Judge Scalia, and that his words were taken out of context by the New York Times, for example. I was wondering if you had commentary on that.
Well, I'll simply say, look, I support the Voting Rights Act, but there is one section which is clearly outdated and outmoded, and that's Section 5, which says to 9 states and to certain cities and counties in other states, including New York, by the way, the Bronx and portions of Manhattan are covered. It says to them, if you had a large statistical discrepancy between the number of people of minority population in your area and the number of minorities who actually voted, if you had a large discrepancy in 1964, 1968, or 1972, you will be permanently covered, at least until the year 2030, by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which says if you want to move a precinct, if you want to do anything with your state election laws, you must seek permission from the Justice Department or the federal court in Washington. Now, that was probably necessary during the height of Jim Crow in the 1960s when there were massive efforts to disenfranchise people. But that data is at best 41 years old. And that data has never been updated. And the states covered have never been updated. So what Justice Scalia was driving at is, once you put in something that's equivalent to a racial entitlement, it remains entrenched no matter what the evidence. Congress is not going to vote out Section 5 because anyone who votes against it will be labeled a racist. They're not stupid, they're politicians. So the only way to remove Section 5 is probably to have a court intervention saying this no longer makes constitutional sense. As for the civil rights issue, let me posit this. There are 2 civil rights when it comes to voting. 2. One is the right not to be prevented from voting, intimidated from voting, blocked from voting, have arbitrary tests for voting. And we fought a civil rights struggle in the 1960s to make sure that wouldn't happen. And I'm glad we did. And we have to preserve those gains. There's a second civil right that you have. You can be just as easily disenfranchised if you have your vote canceled out than if you're prevented from voting. Because if you cast a vote and someone casts a fraudulent vote, you didn't vote. It's canceled out. If somebody's voting who's moved out of state, who's dead, who's a felon, who's a non-citizen, ineligible, or a person who doesn't even exist, that is your civil right is not to have that person vote and cancel your vote out. There are 2 civil rights at stake here. And we need to preserve both, and we can preserve both. And the people in this room want to preserve both, and the other side wants to preserve only one of them, which happens to be to their temporary political advantage.
Ms. Daly?
Yes, there were so many incidents of voter fraud that I heard with this election this year, and I could not understand why the Republicans did not, go after that and look at that. So then as I was digging, what I read, and I don't know if this is true, is that 30 years ago, there was some voter fraud, and Republicans...
41 years ago.
41 years ago, okay. And they questioned the right of the person, and the Democrats called it racism. Supposedly, the Republicans did not want to be called racist, so they signed an agreement that they would never again challenge, a voter fraud case. Now, is that true?
Sort of, mostly, but not quite. And
Okay.
here's what happened.
All right.
In 1981, there was a very, very close election for governor of New Jersey between Tom Kaine and Jim Florio, who later raced for governor. And there was a lot of voter fraud in New Jersey. I live in Hoboken, and next door to Hoboken is Jersey City, which invented voter fraud in the modern sense. The mayor there was Frank I am the law Haig, and he used to joke that everyone has the right to vote in this town, and since there are elderly, the dead should have more rights than others. So there was a lot of voter fraud in New Jersey, and what the Republican Party did was to informally hire off-duty security guards and off-duty cops, and they would wear semi-official security garb, and they would have guns, which they were the right to have, off-duty, and they would stand in front of the polling places carrying signs. And I could see where that would be a form of intimidation given, shall we say, past practices. And I think that was inappropriate. So there was a lawsuit, and the Republican National Committee signed a consent decree saying that the Republican National Committee on a national level would not conduct or pay for any such activities to combat voter fraud in the future. That consent decree is obviously, the circumstances that led to that have long since passed. The federal judge who's in charge of that consent decree and can give yay or nay as to whether or not it continues is on retired status, but still a judge. In fact, he presides over just one case, this case, in Hackensack, New Jersey, and he is 99 years old. And not that, you know, I wish him good health, but I will say that when his seat becomes vacant, I believe this consent decree will finally pass.
So it is true then they can't challenge anything?
Well, no, state parties can, and local organizations can, but the Republican National Committee, which is a national organization, cannot, which does limit its effectiveness. But state parties can, but often state parties are underfinanced or gutless. And outside groups, the best outside group in this area, if you're interested in this subject, is truethevote.org. They are a nationwide group of election observers and election watchers. They do very good work. Their website is very interactive. They give a course on how to be an election watchdog. Online, you don't have to go anywhere for the course. And it's truethevote.org, and I highly recommend the group.
Also, just adding, candidates also are not limited by that. So
Right.
individual candidates who are running for office can defend themselves and protect the integrity of the vote.
This young lady over here, she's been
It's been a long time since I registered to vote, and I have a question. How did I have to prove my citizenship at that point in time? That
You
I
didn't. You didn't. We take it on the honor system.
Really?
If right now, most people register to vote by postcard, which is a federal mandated nationwide form, and it asks you if you're a citizen. It doesn't provide for any proof. When when Georgia passed its voting integrity measures a few years ago, they actually asked people to prove they were citizens when they registered to vote. The Justice Department sued them under Mr. Perez. Remember, he doesn't believe in any immigration law should be enforced whatsoever. Finally, after so much public pressure built up, you know, what is this? You can't demand that someone prove they're a citizen. They finally backed down, but only after tremendous pressure. So it's up to the states or the localities to declare that citizenship has to be something that you prove in order to register to vote. Right now, you just claim it, and there's no checking or verification.
Maryland and then Adam.
I'm just wondering, maybe True the Vote would be the answer to my question. I want to know what somebody like me can do to fix certain things. For example, when my son passed away, the next time I went to vote, I saw his name on the books. Nobody had, checked the records to see that he wasn't able to vote. You could have walked in and you could have said you were in.
How do you know he didn't? How do you know he didn't?
I said at the time I want his name removed. And the next time I went to vote, the name was gone. I don't know if that's just chance or if people listen to me.
No, they probably listen to you.
I want to know how I can get involved in changing the laws or the rules.
TrueTheVote.org is probably your best bet. And by the way, here's one way we know non-citizens do vote. Florida, in one small county around Fort Myers, the local television station, because the registrar of voters couldn't be troubled with it, they're busy with other stuff. The local television station was very clever. They went to the jury rolls, people who serve on juries, and they looked at the forms that people filled out when they were called for jury duty, and a whole bunch of people had said, well, I can't serve on the jury because I'm not a non-citizen. Then they compared that to the voter registration list and the list of people who actually had voted, and there was a significant overlap. In one small county, 99 people. Now, in theory, there are a few people who might have been clever enough to say, well, I'm a non-citizen because I don't want to serve in a jury, but that turned out to be very small. There were about 90 people who had claimed they were non-citizens for purpose of jury duty, but then claimed they were citizens for purposes of voting. They basically convicted themselves. And they went to the first person's house, and he immediately said, oh, no, you caught me. Will you go light on me if I turn others in? Oh. And he turned his whole family in.
Adam has a question.
The state of Oregon has a different voting system than almost every other state in the country. Basically, in Oregon, you don't show up to the polls, you mail in your ballot. Are you familiar with that system, and what do you think of it?
It's insane. And your specific question is?
What do you think of it?
It's the reason why a certain political party has won every statewide race in Oregon for the last 20 years, and the infection has just spread to Washington State. It's insane because, look, first of all, I can understand early voting and absentee voting to a point, but at some point, we don't have an election day anymore. We have election month. We have an election month prior to the election when people vote. We have election day, and then we have election month in which we have to count the votes and fight over the results. It turns out that it's very slow to count paper ballots because that's what remote vote by mail is. It's very slow. Everything has improved and been sped up in our world, except you used to be able to open the newspaper the morning after the election and find out who won. Now in most states you don't do that because they haven't been counted because of all these absentee and paper votes. In addition, I am fundamentally offended by many states that allow people to vote by mail or absentee 2 months before the election. In North Carolina, Barack Obama gave his speech accepting the Democratic nomination at 9 o'clock at night. At 9 a.m. the next morning in North Carolina, you could start voting. This is ridiculous. We have people voting in this country before the first debate. Why do we have a campaign? Why do we bother to have campaigns if people can vote 2 months in advance? Otherwise, you know, I know a lot of the money is wasted on television, but this is ridiculous. We presume that a campaign is conducted so people will be exposed to some arguments that might affect how they vote or how their family and friends vote. And I think vote by mail, once it gets to the point that Oregon and Washington has done it, is a threat to our democracy, not a facilitator to it.
Ed, you had a question?
I'd like to know if you believe that this will be a trend, what happened in New York State in last fall. The governor took it upon himself to say because of the hurricane, wherever a person was, they could vote. We had people from Williamsburg, Brooklyn voting in Sands Point without any documentation. And those votes ostensibly were being sent back to Brooklyn. We'll never know that. Can a governor do this? And if so, are we giving too much credence to them?
Well, under a state of emergency, I'm sure executive officials have often interpreted broad powers. I don't know the answer to that. I will know this. In theory, you could only vote for statewide officials because if you voted outside of your district, obviously there were different congressmen, state senators, assemblymen, city council members you were voting for. I think it is a very dangerous precedent. I'm not going to say there aren't some circumstances where you should allow some leeway. I know in New Jersey, though, a very dangerous precedent. In New Jersey, they allowed internet voting after Hurricane Sandy. Internet voting, and as the county attorney has mentioned, and the gentleman from the IT department, internet voting, I mean, it's one thing to have machines that are vulnerable. It's another thing to have internet voting, and we're not ready yet for that.
I'm confused, and maybe it's because the room is full of lawyers and lawyers have been talking for the last hour, or maybe I was back there and didn't hear it correctly. We have a problem with how it's counted, how the votes are counted, where they're counted, who counts them, what technology is used. Did I miss the, why wouldn't this voter ID resolve all of these problems? So that I could vote if I was in California, because I happen to be on vacation there. And or the next morning that you have an objection to. But, so what's the objection to, why is there no voter ID? And that, I know you started off with that and it was noisy back there. Why don't we have that?
Because there's a bunch of people who say that it's racially discriminatory.
Okay.
That's why.
So that's what it is?
Yes.
They
say there's a, the case of the South Carolina
racially
lawsuit.
discriminatory? Is a license to drive racially discriminatory?
Look, in the state of South Carolina, this is the lawsuit that was thrown out by the judges in Washington. The Justice Department claimed that the reason why South Carolina's voter ID law was unconstitutional was that 9.1% of African Americans in the state of South Carolina lacked a driver's license if they were adults over the age of 18, and among whites it was 8.7%. That difference of 0.4% was viewed as significant and racially discriminatory, and therefore the entire law was to be viewed as unconstitutional. Luckily, the courts threw that out and actually demanded that the Justice Department pay South Carolina's legal bills. But that was the basis of the
But that's absurd. So if less...
Do you think the Obama Justice Department is anything less
No,
than
no.
That's what they do for a living.
The thought is absurd, though,
Absurd as
because
us.
if less African Americans have driver's licenses, racial discrimination in
Bob Dan.
issuing of driver's
We're going to
licenses.
take one more question. Bob Dan.
Grant, question for you. Florida in the last election went through a purging voter rolls. It was in the news, the Wall Street Journal. John, I'm not sure if you wrote an article about that. And it was highly vilified by the press. What was the final outcome? I don't know if Perez was...
The Justice Department gave up and allowed Florida to purge, and the fact that you haven't heard about it since then was no one was discriminated against voting. In other words, when an issue goes away, it means one of two things. It means somebody forgot to complain. In the case of the other side, that never happens. Or there was no news, and all of their fears and all of their objections came to nothing. And the fact that you've heard nothing about it after the initial objections means there was no story. In other words, there was no scandal.
Well, I want to thank our panel members.